When you think of Deliverance, maybe you think of banjos, but you should think of Helen Keller. Today, we're talking about the 1919 silent film, Deliverance, which is about Helen Keller and stars Helen Keller as herself. It also stars Anne Sullivan as herself, as well as Helen Keller's real parents as themselves. You might think of Helen Keller as a distant historical figure. She was born in 1880, after all, but she died in 1968. She was alive when cameras existed. In fact, she was alive when The Miracle Worker came out in 1962. And you're just a few keystrokes away from seeing several interesting videos of Helen Keller that were filmed throughout her life. You're also just a few keystrokes away from watching Deliverance, which is available for free on the Library of Congress YouTube channel. That's one of the handy things about really old movies. You don't have to worry so much about copyright. And the Library of Congress has even blessed us with a high-definition copy of the film. Although once you start watching it, you realize that the source material isn't exactly pristine. There is a big difference, I guess, between high definition in the digital sense and the artifacts of early analog mediums like film. This is the oldest movie I have reviewed on this channel by 24 years. Honestly, I'm not an expert in either Helen Keller or silent film, but I think I can give you a pretty good impression of what this movie is like. I will not be doing a pretty good impression of Helen Keller, but I can give you an impression of the film in case you don't actually want to watch it. And I'll tell you some things that I thought were interesting and that struck me while I was watching the movie, and I guess maybe some things about silent film in general, given that we've not covered one on the channel before. First, a couple of general notes. This movie is more about Helen Keller than anyone else, for one thing. I haven't seen The Miracle Worker, but as I understand it, it's more about Anne Sullivan. This movie, not so much. It's also worth noting that the real Helen Keller is only in the last third of the movie. The first third is about her childhood, growing up in Alabama, and the second third is called Maidenhood and is about her in school. I guess both of these things could be kind of disappointing to some people, but I think all three sections of the movie have some interesting pieces. So we kick things off in the South. Helen Keller was from Alabama. Of course, before we can really get started, the movie gives us a somewhat grandiose frame, as a lot of silent films tend to do, and introduces us to the beautiful Keller estate and to the gargantuan story it's apparently going to tell. When I saw the Keller estate, the first thing that came to mind was plantation. We'll talk about that a little more later. These early scenes are pretty saccharine, showing us this idyllic paradise, showing us the birth, this triumphant moment, but then the music changes, and we're informed of young Helen's ailment. A lot of silent films, especially older ones, are really a series of vignettes, I think, rather than a flowing narrative. And that totally defines this movie. There are a lot of great silent movies, but I think in some ways this vignette approach holds back this movie a little bit. It's hard to give us maybe as much complexity as I would like. We don't really get many scenes showing us how Helen Keller learns or how Anne Sullivan figures out to teach her. We get a vignette of her struggling, of her falling down the hill while wandering around the woods. So we get some ideas about, oh, this is her childhood when she was before she'd met Anne Sullivan. We don't really see her interacting with her parents much then. The intertitles refer to her as being almost animalistic, having crude instincts only. Of course, on the other hand, she is wearing clothes. She does live in a house. So it's not exactly clear how that's balanced. And that animalistic description is later contradicted by the film alluding to the idea that actually she was intelligent all along. Of course, then later on, the movie says, well, now she's no longer dumb, implying that at one point she was. So the wires get a little bit crossed about exactly what Keller's intellect was like, about how much it depended on her language, about what her life was like before language and communication. And maybe to some extent, that's understandable because there are some complicated questions here, complicated questions of linguistics that maybe even today aren't well understood, and certainly in 1919 weren't. Nonetheless, there's a bit of a vagary here, and I kind of wish that we got to see a little bit more about what her life was like and how things changed. We see Anne Sullivan showing up at the estate and talking to Helen Keller a bit in the early days, but we don't really see too many moments where the pieces start to come together, I would say. like I said, it's a lot of vignettes, one slice of time. And I guess the thing that moves us from one scene to another, from one vignette to another, the logic that glues the movie together, isn't the action in the scenes, it's the intertitles. Some people might think that intertitles are the same thing as subtitles, but this isn't the case at all. Intertitles don't simply write out everything that the characters say. Instead, they're a grammatical piece of the film that pivots from one idea to the next. Often, this is in the form of dialogue, but not always. Most silent films have lots of intertitles that are from a more omnipotent perspective, more like narration. Although, without hearing a voice, maybe our view of this is a little bit different. You would think of a movie as having a narrator who is more or less a character, right? I use the term who. This is a subject, a person. You don't really think of silent films as having an intertitler or having anything corresponding to that. More omnipotent. Anyway, in classic Hollywood films, the story often moves forward through decisive moments. You see people put two and two together. You see people realize things. Not so much in this movie. A lot of the vignettes here are quite nice. The score of this movie, performed only with piano in the version that I watched, is good, and the individual scenes offer fairly potent emotional pictures. There are a couple of scenes that I think are really pretty interesting and insightful. Like, we do get a scene where we see Anne Sullivan showing Helen Keller different things around the estate and spelling out the words, the letters for them in her hand. This is a pretty cool insight into how all of this worked, but for me, it kind of raised more questions than it answered. She spells things out letter by letter. Well, in sign language, some things are spelled out letter by letter, but other things, I think, don't they have their own signs? So I'm not sure exactly which system they were using, but also, we hear later some mentions of the alphabet, but it's not really clear, okay, I guess she learned the alphabet at one point, but how do you get from this sort of, series of just like signs made into her hand to a conception of an alphabet? How does she come to understand that there is an alphabet? How does she come to understand that there are verbs and nouns and things like that? Does she? Maybe not. I don't know. There's a lot of things like that where I'm curious, once you get a glimpse of this, I'm like, well, what's the story? How does the system grow? How do you get from this step to the next step? And that's a place where the movie kind of falls apart a little bit. We kind of just get one slice, one moment, one vignette, and then we get another one that happens later. I would have liked to see something alluding to how Anne Sullivan thinks about how to teach. What does she think when she shows up? How does she come up with the idea? Is there some spark of interest? In a classic movie, it's like you see a character think, oh, I see. You see a character learning. We don't really get that much. There is kind of a fun scene where Helen Keller tries to teach sign language to her dog. And this, I think, alludes to a little bit of a more complex narrative. So there are hints of more sophisticated dramatic logic, but only hints. Of course, one thing that's tricky about making a movie like this is that everyone already knows the story of Helen Keller, probably, and it's mostly a happy story. So how do you create drama here? How do you keep people watching the movie? They try a few different things. They introduce a few new storylines and even some new characters. There's actually a big twist in the second half of this movie. I won't mention what it is. No, Helen Keller doesn't learn how to see. These added plot lines are okay, but they kind of feel like footnotes compared to the main story, probably because they are. It's also a little bit unclear about, well, we've got this sort of real story and we've got some sort of narrative devices. I don't think they're based on anything true, but it's kind of interesting that they mix those. Overall, I'd say that the dramatic engine of this movie is a little bit toothless, which isn't to say it's not fun to watch, but it's not as dramatic, I guess, as some films. I found this movie relaxing, and I actually feel that way about a lot of silent films, even suspenseful ones. And it's not to say that there's less going on or that they're simplistic, but I think there's something to their form, this idea of having vignettes. It feels maybe more like walking through a gallery of paintings to me. The intertitles are there to sort of set the stage, and then you see, here's a nice little scene, here's a nice little vignette, here's another one, right? Anyway, let's get to some of the interesting things that pop up in this movie. The first one is probably race. Like I said, Helen Keller was from the South. The racial dynamics of her home are maybe a little more forward than you might see in a later movie, than you might see in classic Hollywood or during the production code era. That's not to say that this movie is subversive. Brazen might be another term for it, but either way, there's some kind of frankness in the film, I think. One interesting example is the dialect used in the intertitles. When black characters speak and it's reported via the intertitles, It's very clear that they're speaking in a strong dialect, speaking very differently from the other characters. That's interesting. Like I said, maybe just a little bit more forward than what you would see in classic Hollywood. This movie is only 4 years out from the birth of a nation. A number of times in this movie, the intertitles tell us about how Helen Keller united people. The intertitles in the beginning talk about the kingdom of darkness and how that's universal. I guess the movie is sort of suggesting that Keller was able to transcend some racial or ethnic prejudices. Sometimes people say that they don't see race, and that can sometimes be a naive thing to say, but in Helen Keller's case, that really would have been true. She also wouldn't have heard the different dialects that people were using. To her, the concept of race would have been understood probably very differently than for almost everybody else. So maybe there is something to this idea that she united people from behind this veil of darkness, and that she avoided these prejudices. The movie doesn't really get to the payoff here, though. I think this ends up being more of a vague illusion than anything too explicit. There's also some class dynamics that pop up, but it's kind of the same story. There's a character who works in a factory in this movie. Helen Keller was a proud socialist, proud member of unions, spokeswoman for them. And it almost seems at one point as if this movie is going to make a case for workers' rights, but it doesn't really. So on both the race and class fronts, they sort of set up some more progressive ideas or something like that, but they don't really finish them off. It's possible they were just trying to avoid making the movie too polarizing, avoid polarizing ideas such as not being a racist. But it's a little hard to know what to make of it. On the flip side, there are a few somewhat strange angles that slip into the movie. For instance, Jesus shows up a few times and guides Helen Keller and her parents. Some quite goofy scenes there. There's also a strong parallel drawn between Helen Keller's struggle for independence and the American Revolutionary War. We even get a reenactment of a battle, which is maybe not something you would expect to see in a movie about Helen Keller. Here, the movie seems to be sticking its hand somewhat randomly into the grab bag of American ideals and throwing some of them up on the screen. There's also an interesting section that takes us back to ancient Greece, which is filmed much more expressionistically. Again, it's not clear why exactly this is in the movie. I think these historical moments maybe lend a certain kind of authority to the film, or that was the idea. The actual content, of course, is pretty simplistic. I guess it creates a certain tone, and the change in style, to be fair, adds some dynamics and some variety. There's another really interesting example of this in a scene where Helen Keller meets Mark Twain. For me, this is so fitting for the era that this movie comes from. It kind of defines this era, to me at least, in some ways. They get an actor to play Mark Twain, and they reenact this historical moment. If you've never seen The Birth of a Nation, you'll have missed out on some similar moments. In that film, they actually introduce certain scenes as, quote, historical facsimiles. And they have one of Lincoln's assassination, for instance. You know who plays John Wilkes Booth? It's Raoul Walsh before he lost an eye. This historical facsimile is a cinematic mode that really dropped off the radar after the silent era. Of course, we've had lots of historical films since then, and there are even movies like Forrest Gump that sort of stage certain historical moments. But these are way more integrated into the narrative flow. And in the case of Forrest Gump, the events are really restaged. The spark comes from things being reimagined. In this movie, it's a bit simpler. It's more like the film is saying, hey, look, here's a historical vignette. Look, it's something that happened. Isn't that cool, guys? And I don't mean to make this sound kind of silly. There is a certain authority and meaning here, a certain historicism, that I think makes this work, even though watching it today, it might seem a little quaint. In some ways, watching movies like this one reminds me of visiting a dime museum. Not that I've ever done that, and not that there are many around. But in 1919 in New York City, for instance, you would have found a bunch of these places. In some ways related to roadside attractions. I guess these were cheap museums that families could come and see historical artifacts, as well as various oddities, some fake stuff, some hoaxes, kind of related to circus culture too, I guess. In fact, P.T. Barnum, before he had a circus, which he actually came to the circus quite late in his life, before he had a circus, he had a dime museum in New York City. The heritage of the American Museum of Natural History here, which is today a very dignified, serious institution, is actually somewhat linked to these seedier businesses. And you can kind of tell somewhat from the taxidermy dioramas there that they're dipping a little bit, or that there's some association with this older mode. Diorama, I think, is a key word here. These days we think about historical recreations, or when we think about historical recreations, we're really going to think about movies and television for the most part. But, there was a time when movies were a new thing in town and television was did not exist, and where I guess a lot of this new medium was borrowing some of its structures from existing things, like dioramas, which were a much bigger deal than you might realize. This diorama, vignette, diorama, very similar idea. So this idea of a silent film sort of taking us on a journey, on a stroll through a dime museum, giving us some of the seedier attractions, giving us some hoaxes, giving us this sort of authorial, pseudo-authoritative thing, appealing to historical figures, all this stuff, appealing to the significance of the Revolutionary War, appealing to ancient Greece, these kind of things. I don't know. I think this comparison between the silent film and the seedy museum is pretty interesting. Let me point out, by the way, that even though the real Helen Keller is in this movie, it's not a documentary. Even once we get to the final third of the movie, we still see reenactments. Of course, there's maybe some additional level of realism given that she really is blind, and so even reenacting things would have involved a lot of the same strategies that she used in her quote-unquote real life. Nonetheless, it's interesting to see that this instinct for reenactment triumphs, I guess, over their access to the real Helen Keller. I mean, they could have made a documentary about Helen Keller. They had Helen Keller. And really, it maybe would have been more interesting. Instead, they reenact things. There might be some practical reasons for this. They do fudge the timing a little bit. For instance, they use the real Helen Keller for the reenactment of her graduation, even though it had happened 15 years before the movie was filmed. And it's a little bit jarring, actually. She looks kind of too old to be graduating from college. She graduated in 1904, I think. It's interesting that they don't use the younger actress who is in the maidenhood part that sort of takes place during school, but I guess the idea is that upon graduation, she reaches her final form. This movie is deeply attached to education, by the way. Education is really the main structure of the movie. It's really what periodizes her life. And one of the additional characters is sort of a foil, an uneducated character that really structures the film, which is, makes sense. School's cool. You do wonder in 1919, I mean, I don't know exactly what people's perspective on school was like, or even how literate people were, but I think it was a totally different ballgame from what it was now when people talk about the value of education. Anyway, I want to mention one more interesting historical moment. At one point, Alexander Graham Bell shows up in the movie. Not the real one, but an actor. Both Bell's wife and mother were deaf, and the story goes that his was experiments with hearing that led him to invent the telephone. Although that's a bit controversial. And actually, Alexander Graham Bell's involvement with the deaf community overall is controversial. He was a proponent of something called oralism, where the deaf are taught to speak and to read lips. That was the idea. Usually this meant that they were discouraged from using sign language. In some deaf schools, people had to wear special gloves that wouldn't allow them to sign. Alexander Graham Bell, apparently, some of his actions led to closing down a lot of places where sign language was taught. Of course, it turned out that sign language is what actually works, and oralism doesn't. It's kind of a dirty word these days. I guess there's no doubting that Bell tried to help deaf people, but maybe he did more harm than good. It's a bit hard to know. I talk about this in more depth in my review of Mandy, also known as Crash of Silence, which is a film all about oralism. That's one of my early videos. A pretty decent movie, even though it's a little, even though it sort of goes all in on this outdated idea. Anyway, Alexander Graham Bell is not quite as popular today as he once was. In this movie, he's introduced as the great doctor or something like that. He's shown as a great man. This is another trope of silent films. I've sort of alluded to it already, this idea of great men. And yeah, it's another component of the interesting relationship this movie has with history. Later on, the film decrees that Helen Keller and Napoleon are the two great people of the 19th century. Now, this is quite a claim. It's not something that you would really find in a movie today, films just offering their opinion on something like that. It's kind of a strange claim to make as well. Napoleon being seen as a great man is a very particular view of greatness. I guess it's right in line, though, with a certain look at America and its history. It's hard for me to put it into words exactly, but I guess, like I said, on one level, a history of great men. And if you compare this to how movies from the 1960s, for instance, might have talked about history, completely different idea. Completely different idea. You might wonder, even if we're returning a little bit to this American obsession with big men, given how much billionaires and technocrats dominate the news cycle now. But that's a very complicated question that I won't get into. Anyway, I think I've rambled enough about this movie. Deliverance is pretty cool in some ways. There are much better silent films than Deliverance, to be honest. To be fair, most of the ones that I like are from the mid-20s, so they're newer. 1919 really was a long time ago. This is an old movie. I think there's a lot of interesting things in it, though, and it is definitely watchable. I even enjoyed watching it. It's not that long, for one thing. Do they make the most of, having the real Helen Keller appearing? Not really. It's a bit of a gimmick. If you're really interested in Helen Keller, there are probably documentaries that will be more informative and more interesting, and that won't have all these weird quirks of an old movie. So, when I first heard of this movie, I thought, dang, there's a movie with Helen Keller in it? That's crazy. Why haven't more people watched this? Well, after I watched the movie, I sort of have a little bit of an idea why more people have not seen the movie. Nonetheless, though, it is, I think, worth watching it. There's some interesting things to pick up, and like I said, it ain't that long, so might as well. That's Deliverance from 1919, and for those of you who are wondering, I will not be reviewing Deliverance from 1972 on the channel. I've already seen it. Interesting movie, though.